Step back from the aircraft, sir. Lieutenant Connor Hale's voice cracked across the hangar like a warning siren, sharp with irritation and stretched thin from 6 straight weeks of failure. The old man standing beyond the yellow maintenance line did not move. Around them, the cavernous interior of Hangar 12 vibrated with the hollow hum of industrial lights and the distant whine of auxiliary generators somewhere out on the tarmac. The smell of hot hydraulic fluid and jet fuel clung thick in the air, heavy enough to taste. In the center of the hangar sat the aircraft that had turned half the base into a pressure cooker. A gray C-130 retrofit surveillance platform, 42 feet tall at the tail and nearly 100 feet from nose to ramp, rested silent beneath rows of floodlights. Its left engine cowling hung open like an exposed wound, while 6 civilian contractors and 2 Air Force specialists stood around laptops glowing green with diagnostics that had already failed them for 43 consecutive days. Every system check said the aircraft was operational. Every scan cleared it for flight. Yet every time they tried ignition, the starboard engine died exactly 11 seconds into startup. 11 seconds. No more. No less. Connor Hale rubbed a hand across his jaw and glared at the old man again. "This is a restricted maintenance zone," he snapped. "You can't just wander in here." The old man's pale blue eyes drifted from the aircraft to Connor without urgency. He looked to be somewhere in his late 70s, maybe older. White hair curled beneath a faded olive cap. A weathered brown jacket hung loose across narrow shoulders. In one hand, he carried an old leather tool pouch darkened by decades of oil and heat. He looked less like a mechanic and more like a retired farmer who had accidentally walked onto a military base. A younger technician standing beside Connor smirked under his breath. Probably thinks he can fix it with duct tape and a wrench from Vietnam. A few others laughed quietly. The old man ignored them. His attention returned to the aircraft. Not the diagnostics. Not the monitors. The aircraft itself. His eyes moved slowly across the propeller assembly, then toward the landing gear struts, then higher toward the engine housing where heat shimmered beneath the lights. Connor followed his gaze with growing annoyance. "Sir," he said louder this time, "step back from the aircraft." The old man finally spoke. His voice was low and rough, worn smooth by age and years of breathing turbine exhaust. "She's compensating." The technicians exchanged confused looks. Connor frowned. "Excuse me." The old man nodded toward the engine. "That vibration shouldn't be reaching the landing gear." One of the contractors scoffed immediately. "There is no vibration." "There is," the old man replied calmly. "You just can't feel it over the generators." Silence settled awkwardly over the group. Somewhere deeper in the hangar, compressed air hissed from a valve line. Connor folded his arms tighter across his chest. "We've run every scan imaginable on this aircraft," he said. "Thermal imaging, fuel pressure diagnostics, live engine simulation. We've got $3 million in software checking every subsystem in real time." The old man nodded once as if none of that surprised him. "And she still dies after 11 seconds. Connor's jaw tightened. That answer hit harder than it should have. Because it was true. 6 weeks. 6 specialists. Thousands of labor hours. And the aircraft still sat grounded while command staff screamed for answers. Outside the hangar doors, the late afternoon sun burned across the runway in shimmering waves of heat. A transport convoy rolled past in the distance, while somewhere overhead another aircraft thundered across the sky, its echo rattling faintly through the metal beams above them. But inside Hangar 12, everything seemed frozen around the old man standing quietly beside the yellow line. Connor hated the feeling creeping into the room, the shift in attention, the subtle uncertainty spreading through his crew. He had spent years building a reputation on precision and control. The last thing he needed was some retired relic making his people doubt the process. "Sir," Connor said carefully, forcing patience into his voice. "With respect, this aircraft is being handled by certified specialists." The old man looked back at the engine again. "That's the problem." A few nervous chuckles escaped the younger techs. Connor stepped forward. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" The old man's eyes never left the aircraft. "Means you're listening to computers instead of the machine." The words landed heavier than anyone expected. Connor opened his mouth to fire back when suddenly a sharp metallic click echoed from somewhere deep inside the aircraft's engine housing. Tiny, barely audible. Most of the crew didn't even react. But the old man did. Instantly, his expression changed almost too subtly to notice. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion, recognition, like a man hearing a familiar voice after 40 years. The entire hangar seemed to shrink around that single sound. The old man took one slow step forward toward the aircraft before Connor instinctively moved into his path. I said step back from the aircraft, sir. This time the old man finally looked him directly in the eyes. Calm, unshaken, almost tired. Son, he said quietly, if that engine keeps trying to start like this, you're about 3 attempts away from losing the whole fuel control assembly. The laughter vanished. Completely. Somewhere behind Connor, one of the younger airmen slowly lowered his tablet screen and stared at the old man in silence. The silence inside Hangar 12 stretched tight enough to snap. Lieutenant Connor Hale stared at the old man for a long moment while the low mechanical hum of the grounded aircraft vibrated through the concrete beneath their boots. No one laughed now. Even the younger technicians who had been grinning seconds earlier suddenly found the floor interesting. The old man stood perfectly still near the yellow maintenance stripe, one weathered hand resting lightly on the strap of his leather tool pouch, while the floodlights above reflected faintly in his pale blue eyes. Connor forced out a dry scoff. That is impossible, he said, though the confidence behind the words felt thinner now. Fuel control assembly checks came back clean every single time. The old man nodded once toward the open engine cowling. Because the problem is not inside the assembly. One of the civilian contractors folded his arms defensively. Then where is it? The old man looked toward the landing gear again. Upstream vibration feedback. The contractor blinked. That makes no sense. No, the old man replied calmly. It makes noise. Connor exhaled sharply through his nose. Okay, enough. He stepped forward again, placing himself directly between the old man and the aircraft. You are not authorized to be here, and I am not about to let some retired mechanic start throwing guesses at a multi-million-dollar platform. The old man's expression did not change. I did not guess. Connor opened his mouth to answer, but another metallic tick echoed faintly from deep inside the engine housing. Tiny. Irregular. Most of the crew missed it entirely. The old man did not. His eyes narrowed again, listening with an intensity that made Connor uncomfortable. There, the old man said quietly. Hear it. Connor heard nothing except the distant rumble of another aircraft taxiing across the far runway outside. Hear what? The old man tilted his head slightly toward the engine. The hesitation. One of the younger technicians muttered under his breath. This guy talks about engines like they are people. The old man glanced toward him without irritation. Machines talk all the time. Most people are just too loud to hear them. The words settled heavily into the hangar air. Connor suddenly became aware of every sound around him. The hydraulic hiss from a nearby maintenance lift. The clicking cool-down noise inside the engine housing. The faint rattle of tools somewhere across the bay. Even the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead seemed sharper now. Connor hated it. Hated that the old man's presence was changing the atmosphere inside his hangar. Hated that some part of him was beginning to wonder if the old man might actually know something. He pushed the feeling down hard. You said upstream vibration feedback, Connor said carefully. Explain it. The old man finally shifted his gaze fully onto him. Your engine is compensating for an imbalance before ignition. One of the specialists shook his head immediately. Impossible. We checked. Rotor alignment 3 separate times. You checked static alignment, the old man corrected. Not live load flex. The contractor frowned. That would not affect startup. Not on newer engines, the old man replied. This aircraft was rebuilt 3 times over 20 years using parts from 3 different production generations. She is carrying stress where she should not. Connor blinked despite himself. That detail was classified to maintenance command personnel only. The contractor stared at the old man. How the hell would you know that? The old man looked back toward the aircraft again. Because the left gear strut is vibrating half a second late. Silence swallowed the room. Somewhere near the back wall, Airman Noah Briggs slowly lowered the tablet in his hands. He had spent the last 6 weeks shadowing diagnostics teams, while everyone above him argued about software failures and pressure mapping. None of them had ever even looked at the landing gear. Noah found himself staring at the old man differently now. Not like a civilian. Not like a retiree. Like something older. Sharper. Dangerous in a quiet kind of way. Connor crossed his arms tighter. You were telling me you figured out in 5 minutes what 6 specialists missed for 6 weeks. No, the old man replied softly. I figured out what the aircraft has been trying to tell you for 6 weeks. Another silence followed that one. Longer this time. Heavy. Outside the hangar, wind rolled across the tarmac, carrying the smell of rain and burned jet fuel through the open bay doors. The old man slowly stepped sideways, his eyes never leaving the engine housing. Connor noticed something unsettling then. The old man was not looking at the aircraft the way mechanics usually did. He was studying it the way experienced pilots studied weather. The way combat veterans studied danger before it arrived. Like he was waiting for the machine to reveal something alive beneath the metal. Noah swallowed hard. Sir, he said carefully toward Connor. Maybe we should at least let him explain the vibration issue. Connor shot him a cold look. You want to hand over a classified aircraft to a random old man carrying a toolbox? From the 1970s? Noah hesitated. The old man answered instead. 1968. Connor looked back at him. What? The old man lightly adjusted the worn leather pouch hanging at his side. The toolbox. His eyes drifted toward the aircraft again. 1968. Then for the first time since entering the hangar, the old man took one slow step closer to the aircraft itself, and every person in Hangar 12 instinctively watched him do it. The old man stopped 3 feet from the aircraft's exposed engine, housing, and slowly tilted his head, as if listening to something buried beneath layers of steel and turbine heat. Nobody in Hangar 12 moved. The floodlights overhead cast long shadows across the concrete floor while the smell of scorched hydraulic fluid drifted through the stagnant air. Lieutenant Connor Hale watched the old man carefully now, irritation mixing with something colder beneath it. Unease. The old man reached out slowly, resting 2 fingers against the outer panel beneath the starboard engine intake. He did not press hard, barely touched it at all. Then he closed his eyes. One of the contractors let out an awkward laugh. What is he doing? Nobody answered. Connor folded his arms tighter. Sir, this is not some old prop plane at an airshow. You cannot diagnose a modern aircraft by touching it. The old man opened his eyes again. I am not diagnosing it. His fingers remained against the metal. I am listening. Connor shook his head in disbelief. To what? Stress. The word landed softly but seemed to settle over the entire hangar. The old man slowly moved his hand lower along the panel seam until his fingertips paused near a row of recessed bolts. There, he murmured quietly. That one. Connor frowned. What about it? It was removed recently. One of the contractors immediately scoffed. Every panel on this aircraft has been opened 50 times in the last month. The old man nodded slightly. Not this bolt. The contractor stepped forward defensively. I torqued every one of those myself. I know. The contractor blinked. What? The old man pointed gently toward the recessed edge of the bolt head. You stripped. The finish using a steel driver instead of composite. The contractor's face changed instantly. Connor looked toward him sharply. Is that true? The contractor hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. Connor's eyes narrowed. Damn it, Rick. It was cosmetic, the contractor muttered quickly. The bolt seated perfectly. But the old man was already crouching slowly beside the landing gear assembly, his knees cracking softly with age as he lowered himself near the hydraulic strut. Noah Briggs found himself stepping closer without realizing it. The old man leaned near the gear housing and looked upward toward the engine mount supports. His pale eyes moved carefully across the rivet lines and support brackets while the distant rumble of thunder rolled faintly somewhere outside beyond the runway. She shifted, the old man said quietly. Connor exhaled in frustration. Who shifted? The engine mount. Connor stared at him. That mount was laser-aligned last week. After the vibration started, the old man corrected. Not before. Silence again. The old man slowly rose back to his feet, one hand briefly steadying himself against the aircraft's fuselage. For just a second his fingers brushed the metal skin near the engine housing, and something in his expression changed. Faintly, almost impossible to notice. But Noah saw it. The old man was not standing in Hangar 12 anymore. Not completely. Somewhere behind those pale blue eyes another memory had surfaced. Rotor wash. Humid air. Rain striking hot metal. The distant rhythmic thunder of helicopter blades cutting through jungle heat. The old man's hand remained against the aircraft for one lingering second longer before he blinked and returned to the present. Connor noticed it too. You worked aircraft maintenance before? He asked carefully. The old man glanced toward him. A little. One of the younger techs snorted quietly. Noah ignored him. What kind of aircraft? The old man looked back toward the engine housing again. Mostly helicopters. Connor gave a dry laugh. That explains it. Noah frowned slightly. What does? Connor gestured toward the old man. He thinks this thing talks. Because he spent his career around aircraft held together with duct tape in the jungle. A few nervous laughs returned around the hangar, but weaker this time. Forced. The old man did not react to the insult. He simply walked slowly along the aircraft side until he stopped beneath the wing root near the fuel access panel. His eyes narrowed again. You replaced the secondary fuel regulator. Connor blinked. Yes. Twice. Connor's expression hardened slightly. How did you know that? The old man looked toward the open maintenance cart 30 feet away where two discarded regulators still sat wrapped in plastic. Connor followed his gaze and immediately felt stupid for asking. But the old man spoke again before anyone could recover. The replacements were never the problem. Connor rubbed a hand across his face. Then what is? The old man looked directly at the aircraft now, not at Connor, not at the crew, but at the machine itself. The giant grounded aircraft seemed impossibly still beneath the floodlights, like some wounded animal refusing to die. Then the old man finally spoke the words that made the entire room go silent again. Your engine is fighting the airframe. Nobody moved. Even the contractors stopped pretending to understand what was happening. Noah felt a knot tighten in his stomach because somehow, against all logic, the old man sounded absolutely certain. Connor stared at him for several seconds before speaking carefully. Explain that. The old man reached slowly into the worn leather pouch hanging at his side. The ancient brass snap clicked open softly beneath his fingers. Every eye in the hangar followed the movement. Inside the pouch rested old tools darkened by age and oil. Simple tools. Small wrenches. A flashlight worn smooth with use. And tucked carefully into one corner was a faded cloth patch stitched with wings, so old the thread had nearly turned gray. Noah caught a glimpse of lettering above the wings before the old man lifted a narrow inspection mirror from the pouch and closed it again. But the single word he saw on that patch made his pulse stumble for reasons he could not explain. Khe Sanh. Noah Briggs could not stop staring at the faded patch inside the old leather pouch. Khe Sanh. The word lingered in his mind like the echo of something important he was supposed to recognize. Around him, the atmosphere inside Hangar 12 had changed completely. The laughter was gone now. Even the contractors who had spent the last hour dismissing the old man suddenly looked uncomfortable standing near him. Lieutenant Connor Hale still held on to his authority with both hands, but Noah could see the strain behind it. The old man's calm certainty was slowly dismantling the room piece by piece. Connor gestured impatiently toward the aircraft. You said the engine is fighting the airframe. Explain it clearly. The old man turned the inspection mirror slowly in his fingers before crouching near the lower engine access panel. When this aircraft was rebuilt, he said quietly, they reinforced the engine mount supports. Connor nodded once. Correct. But they did not reinforce the surrounding frame evenly. Connor frowned slightly. That should not matter during startup. Normally, no. The old man angled the small mirror beneath the panel seam, studying something hidden deep inside the housing. But your replacement regulator changed the pressure response timing. One of the contractors shook his head. Pressure timing shifts are microscopic. Microscopic is still movement, the old man replied calmly. And movement becomes stress. The contractor opened his mouth to argue again, but stopped himself. Because none of them could explain why the aircraft kept dying after 11 seconds either. The old man leaned closer beneath the engine housing, his weathered fingers tracing lightly along the underside of the panel. Then he paused completely. His eyes narrowed. The hangar seemed to fall silent around him again. Noah heard only the low hum of electricity overhead and the distant tapping of rain beginning outside beyond the runway. Tiny droplets rattled softly against the massive hangar doors. The old man's fingers remained motionless beneath the panel. Connor crossed his arms tighter. What is it? The old man did not answer immediately. Instead, he slowly closed his eyes for one brief second. And suddenly the smell of jet fuel in the hangar vanished from his mind. Humid jungle air replaced it instead. Rotor wash thundered through darkness. Rain hammered against metal skin while warning lights flickered red across a cockpit, soaked in heat and hydraulic smoke. He was 22 years old again, hanging half outside a damaged helicopter somewhere near the mountains west of Khe Sanh while frightened young Marines waited silently behind him. The aircraft had been dying beneath his hands then too. Different machine. Same sound. Same uneven vibration hidden underneath the engine rhythm. He remembered placing 2 fingers against hot metal while the pilot shouted over the screaming turbines. "Tell me she can fly." The aircraft had trembled beneath his hand exactly the same way this one did now. Not mechanical failure. Structural resistance. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. The old man opened his eyes again and looked upward into the engine housing. "There you are," he murmured softly. Connor frowned. "What?" The old man stood slowly, his knees cracking faintly as he rose. Then he pointed toward a narrow section of support framing buried deep behind the regulator housing where almost nobody could see without removing half the assembly. Hairline stress fracture. The contractors immediately stepped forward. "That is impossible. You cannot even see that section without pulling the housing." The old man handed the inspection mirror calmly toward Connor. "Look closer." Connor hesitated only a second before taking the mirror. He crouched near the panel reluctantly, adjusting the angle toward the support frame buried inside the assembly. At first he saw nothing except shadows and layered metal. Then the light shifted slightly. His stomach tightened instantly. A thin silver line no thicker than a strand of thread stretched across the support bracket near the engine mount. Tiny, almost invisible, but unmistakably real. Connor stared at it in silence. One of the contractors pushed closer beside him. "No way." Another leaned in behind them. "How did we miss that?" The old man answered without emotion. "Because you trusted the diagnostics more than the aircraft." Nobody spoke after that. Rain rolled harder now against the hangar roof, creating a steady metallic roar overhead while Connor slowly rose back to his feet, holding the mirror in numb silence. 6 weeks. 6 specialists. Thousands of system scans. And the old man had found the problem in less than 10 minutes using a flashlight and a mirror older than most of the crew standing there. Noah watched Connor carefully. The lieutenant looked shaken now. Not angry anymore. Something worse. Embarrassed. The old man gently took the inspection mirror back and slipped it into the leather pouch again beside the faded patch. "The fracture widens under ignition load," he said quietly. "The mount shifts. Fuel pressure compensation overcorrects. Engine shuts itself down to prevent catastrophic stress." One of the contractors stared at him. "That should have triggered a structural warning." "It tried to," the old man replied. "But your software filtered it out as vibration noise." Silence swallowed the hangar again. Noah felt it spreading through the room now. Not fear exactly. Respect. Heavy and uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. The old man adjusted the strap of the worn leather pouch across his shoulder and looked once more toward the grounded aircraft sitting beneath the floodlights. His pale eyes softened slightly. "She has been trying to tell you the truth for 6 weeks, he said quietly. "You just stopped listening after the computers disagreed." For several long seconds, nobody inside Hangar 12 spoke at all. Rain hammered steadily against the roof now, filling the silence with a dull metallic roar while the grounded aircraft sat beneath the floodlights like something exhausted after a long fight. Lieutenant Connor Hale remained frozen beside the exposed engine housing, the inspection mirror still hanging loosely in his hand. The thin fracture hidden inside the support bracket had changed everything in an instant. 6 weeks of confidence had collapsed into embarrassment so quietly it almost hurt to watch. One of the contractors finally cleared his throat. "We need to notify structural command immediately." Another shook his head slowly, still staring toward the fracture. How did every scan miss this? The old man adjusted the strap of his worn leather pouch across his shoulder. "Because the aircraft compensated too well." Connor looked up sharply. "Compensated?" The old man nodded toward the engine mount. "She kept correcting the imbalance during startup. The software interpreted the correction as normal fluctuation." Connor rubbed a hand across his face again, exhaustion suddenly visible in every movement. "You are telling me the aircraft hit its own failure?" "No," the old man replied quietly. "I am telling you the aircraft tried to survive." The words settled heavily over the crew. Noah Briggs felt the tension shifting again inside the hangar. Earlier they had looked at the old man like an unwanted distraction. Now every technician in the room was watching him the way students watched a professor who had just solved an impossible equation without notes. Connor stared toward the engine housing for another moment before finally speaking carefully. If that fracture widened under ignition load, eventually the mount would fail completely. The old man finished calmly. One of the contractors swallowed hard. That could have destroyed the engine. The old man nodded once. Or worse. Nobody continued that thought aloud. Rainwater rolled in small streams beneath the massive hangar doors, while distant lightning flickered somewhere beyond the runway. The old man slowly walked toward the maintenance cart near the aircraft and rested his weathered hands lightly against its metal edge. Noah noticed the deep oil stains worked permanently into his fingers now. Not ordinary mechanic stains. Old stains. Decades old. Like the metal itself had become part of him. Connor approached more slowly this time. The arrogance in his posture was gone now, replaced by something far more uncomfortable for a young officer. Humility. Who are you exactly? He asked quietly. The old man looked at him for a moment before answering. Ethan Vance. Connor frowned slightly. No. I mean, where did you learn this? Ethan's pale blue eyes drifted toward the aircraft again, mostly in places where aircraft did not get second chances. Another silence followed that answer. Noah felt it immediately. The room understood there was a much larger story sitting quietly in front of them now. Connor glanced toward the faded leather pouch hanging at Ethan's side. Khe Sanh, he said carefully. Ethan's expression barely changed. Long time ago. Connor nodded slowly. You served there? Ethan gave the faintest shrug. For a while. One of the contractors looked confused. Wait. Khe Sanh aviation maintenance. Ethan remained quiet. Noah's eyes widened slightly as something clicked in his memory. 2 nights earlier, he had been helping organize old archive boxes and base records when he found a faded photograph from Vietnam. Helicopter crews standing beside damaged Hueys covered in mud and rain. And in the corner of the image, someone had handwritten a phrase beneath one crew chief's name. The man who hears engines die. Noah stared toward Ethan now with a strange feeling crawling slowly up his spine. The old man noticed him looking. Something wrong, Airman? Noah hesitated. No, sir. Ethan smiled faintly at the word sir, but said nothing. Connor glanced toward the aircraft again. Can it be repaired? Ethan looked toward the fractured mount support beneath the engine housing. Yes. Relief moved visibly through the room. One of the contractors exhaled loudly. Another immediately reached for a tablet. But Ethan raised one hand slightly. Not tonight. Connor frowned. Why not? Ethan nodded toward the roof as rain thundered harder overhead. Metal contracts differently in cold rain after prolonged turbine heat. The contractor holding the tablet blinked. You are worried about thermal stress? Ethan looked at him calmly. I am worried about impatient people making tired decisions. Nobody argued with that. Connor slowly handed the inspection mirror back toward Ethan. Their fingers brushed briefly as Ethan took it. Connor hesitated before speaking again. You found that fracture in under 10 minutes. Ethan slipped the mirror carefully back into the leather pouch beside the faded patch. No, he said softly. I found it 40 years ago. Connor stared at him in confusion. Ethan looked toward the grounded aircraft beneath the floodlights while rain rolled endlessly across the runway outside. Aircraft never really change, he murmured quietly. Only the people listening to them do. Then somewhere near the rear of the hangar, Noah's phone vibrated softly in his pocket. He glanced down absently at the screen and froze. The incoming message displayed only 6 words from an unknown command extension. Do not let Ethan Vance leave. Noah Briggs stared down at the message on his phone while cold unease crawled slowly through his chest. Do not let Ethan Vance leave. No name attached. No signature. Just a restricted command extension number he had never seen before. Around him, Hangar 12 remained trapped in that strange heavy silence that follows the moment everyone realizes they have misunderstood someone important. Rain hammered against the roof hard enough now to shake faint vibrations through the steel beams overhead, while maintenance crews quietly circled the grounded aircraft with an entirely different kind of caution than before. Nobody mocked Ethan anymore. Nobody laughed. The old man stood beside the maintenance cart beneath the floodlights, calmly wiping the inspection mirror with a folded cloth before placing it carefully back into the worn leather pouch. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a man who had spent a lifetime taking care of tools because tools were sometimes the only thing keeping people alive. Lieutenant Connor Hale watched him from several feet away, arms folded tightly across his chest, but the edge in his posture had disappeared completely. Noah had seen officers angry before, frustrated before. Connor was neither now. He looked unsettled. "You knew exactly where to look," Connor said quietly over the sound of rain. Ethan shrugged faintly. "The vibration told me." Connor shook his head slowly. "No, that is not normal." Ethan gave the faintest smile, without humor. "Neither is surviving long enough to get old around aircraft." Noah slipped his phone back into his pocket, but his pulse still felt uneven. The message bothered him more the longer he thought about it. Somebody high enough in command already knew who Ethan Vance was. Worse than that, they sounded worried he might leave before someone important arrived. One of the civilian contractors approached Connor, holding a tablet. "Structural Command confirmed the fracture pattern," he said carefully. "Everything he said checks out." Connor nodded once without taking his eyes off Ethan. "Can they repair it?" "Yes, sir. But they are saying the mount assembly should have failed weeks ago." Ethan answered before Connor could. The old reinforcement held longer than expected. The contractor frowned. "How would you know what reinforcement was used?" Ethan looked toward the aircraft again. "Because I helped install it." The contractor blinked. "What?" Noah looked up sharply. Connor stared at Ethan for several long seconds. "That aircraft was rebuilt in Arizona 12 years ago." Ethan nodded. "I know." Connor's expression tightened slightly. "You worked the rebuild program?" Ethan adjusted the cuff of his faded jacket slowly. For a little while. Another silence rolled through the hangar. Noah noticed the contractors exchanging looks now. Not skeptical anymore. Trying to place him. Trying to understand how an old man carrying tools older than half the crew somehow knew classified structural details nobody else remembered. Outside, lightning flashed white through the rain-soaked runway beyond the open hangar doors. The brief burst of light illuminated Ethan's face for a split second, and Noah suddenly noticed how tired the old man looked. Not weak, just worn down in the quiet way old combat veterans often carried themselves. Like sleep had never fully caught up with them after certain years of their lives. Connor glanced toward the leather pouch again. "How long have you been working aircraft?" Ethan looked toward the grounded engine housing. "Since 1966. One of the younger techs quietly muttered, "Good Lord." Ethan ignored him. Connor let out a slow breath. "That is over 50 years. Closer to 60. Noah found himself staring at Ethan's hands again. Oil stains embedded deep into the skin. Small scars faded pale with age. Hands that looked like they belonged to the aircraft as much as the metal itself did. Connor rubbed the back of his neck slowly. "Why are you even here tonight?" Ethan's eyes drifted toward the rain outside. "Someone asked me to stop by." Connor frowned. "Who?" Before Ethan could answer, a sharp electronic chirp suddenly echoed through the hangar from Connor's radio clipped near his shoulder. The entire maintenance crew looked up instinctively. Connor grabbed the radio immediately. "Hale." Static crackled for a second beneath the sound of rain. Then a clipped voice answered. "Lieutenant, remain where you are. Senior Command is inbound to your location now." Connor frowned. "For what?" A brief pause followed. "For him." Every eye in the hangar shifted toward Ethan instantly. Connor looked back toward the old man, standing quietly beside the maintenance cart. Ethan's expression did not change at all. If anything, he almost looked disappointed. "Who is inbound?" Connor asked carefully into the radio. Another pause. Then the answer came low and immediate. "Major General Richard Mercer." The reaction inside the hangar was instant. One of the contractors straightened so quickly he nearly dropped his tablet. Another cursed softly under his breath. Even Connor's posture changed. A two-star general did not personally visit maintenance hangars during storms unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. Connor looked toward Ethan again, confusion growing rapidly now. "You know General Mercer?" Ethan looked down at the old leather pouch in his hands for a moment before answering quietly. "I knew his father." Rain thundered harder across the roof. Somewhere outside, engines roared faintly through the storm as headlights began cutting through the darkness beyond the runway gates. Noah felt his stomach tighten again, because suddenly the entire base seemed to be moving toward one quiet old man who had walked into the hangar carrying a 60-year-old toolbox and solved a 6-week failure in under 10 minutes. The atmosphere inside Hangar 12 shifted completely the moment the words Major General Richard Mercer left the radio speaker. Nobody spoke for several seconds afterward. Rain hammered against the roof in heavy waves while distant headlights cut through the storm outside the hangar doors, growing brighter by the second. The contractors straightened instinctively. One technician quietly zipped his coveralls all the way to his neck. Another shoved loose tools back into the maintenance cart with sudden nervous urgency. Lieutenant Connor Hale stared at Ethan Vance as if seeing him for the first time. "You knew General Mercer's father?" Connor repeated carefully. Ethan nodded once. "Long time ago." Connor frowned. "You worked together?" Ethan's pale blue eyes drifted toward the grounded aircraft beneath the floodlights. "Something like that." The answer only deepened the silence. Noah Briggs could feel tension spreading through the hangar now, but it was no longer the tension of failure or embarrassment. It was anticipation, the kind that settles over a room when everyone suddenly realizes they have stumbled into something much larger than themselves. Outside, tires hissed across rain-soaked pavement as a convoy of black SUVs rolled toward the hangar through the storm. Their headlights reflected across the wet runway in long silver streaks. Connor looked toward the entrance, then back toward Ethan. "You could have told us who you were." Ethan gave the faintest shrug. "You did not ask." One of the younger techs muttered softly under his breath. "We kind of did." Ethan almost smiled at that, but said nothing. Noah noticed the old man's attention drifting back toward the aircraft again despite the approaching convoy. Even now, with half the base apparently moving toward him, Ethan seemed more focused on the grounded engine than on the people around him. Like the machine still mattered more. Connor studied him carefully. "How did General Mercer even know you were here?" Ethan adjusted the worn leather strap across his shoulder. "Probably because somebody called him." Noah immediately looked away before anyone noticed the guilt crossing his face. He had not called the general himself, but after receiving that strange command message, he had quietly forwarded Ethan's name through maintenance records to a restricted command directory. He had not expected the response to arrive this fast. The convoy stopped outside the hangar with military precision. Doors opened instantly despite the rain. Security personnel moved first, spreading quietly around the entrance while several officers hurried beneath umbrellas toward the building. Then Major General Richard Mercer stepped through the storm into Hangar 12. The effect on the room was immediate. Every person inside the hangar snapped upright instinctively. Conversations vanished. Tablets lowered. Boots squared against concrete. Connor Hale stood at attention before his mind even caught up with his body. Mercer was a tall man in his late 50s with silver at his temples and the kind of command presence that seemed to bend the air around him. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his dark uniform as he stepped fully beneath the floodlights. But the general barely looked at the aircraft, barely looked at the maintenance crews. His eyes locked directly onto Ethan Vance from the moment he entered the hangar. And for the first time since anyone had met him that night, Ethan Vance looked uncomfortable. The general crossed the distance quickly without speaking. Connor swallowed hard as Mercer walked straight past him without acknowledgement. The entire hangar remained perfectly silent except for rain pounding against steel somewhere overhead. Ethan stood still beside the maintenance cart, one weathered hand resting lightly on the old leather pouch. General Mercer stopped directly in front of him. For one long second, neither man spoke. Then something happened that nobody in Hangar 12 expected. The two-star general slowly raised his hand in a crisp military salute. The entire room froze. Noah felt his stomach drop. Connor stared in complete disbelief. A general officer was saluting an old civilian mechanic standing beside a toolbox from 1968. Ethan looked almost annoyed by the attention. Slowly, reluctantly, he returned the salute. Mercer lowered his hand carefully. "I heard you found the fracture." Ethan nodded once. It was not hiding very hard. A faint smile touched the general's face for the first time. "That sounds like you." Connor's pulse hammered in his ears now. None of this made sense anymore. He glanced around the hangar and realized every contractor looked just as stunned as he felt. Mercer finally turned toward the aircraft. "How bad?" Ethan looked toward the exposed engine housing. "Reparable." Relief passed visibly across the general's expression. "Good." Then Mercer looked back at Ethan again, and something quieter entered his voice. "Respect. Deep and personal. My father used to talk about you." Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the aircraft. Your father talked too much. A few nervous chuckles escaped from the maintenance crew before dying instantly when nobody else laughed. But Mercer did not seem offended. If anything, the comments softened him further. He said you could hear problems before the instruments could. Ethan shrugged faintly. Machines tell the truth if you listen long enough. Mercer nodded slowly. He also said you saved his crew near Khe Sanh. The hangar went dead silent again. Even the rain outside seemed distant now. Ethan looked away slightly at the mention of Khe Sanh. For the first time all night, Noah saw a real weight settle across the old man's face. Not pride. Memory. Mercer's voice lowered quietly. He never forgot what you did for them. Ethan remained silent for several long seconds. Then he finally answered without looking at anyone. Neither did the aircraft. The silence after Ethan Vance's words settled across Hangar 12 like heavy fog. Neither did the aircraft. The sentence lingered in the air beneath the steady roar of rain hammering the roof, while every person in the room tried to process the strange gravity surrounding the old man beside the maintenance cart. Major General Richard Mercer stood motionless for a long moment, his expression unreadable beneath the harsh floodlights. Then slowly, almost carefully, he turned toward the grounded aircraft. How long until repairs can begin? One of the contractors straightened immediately. Structural crews are already inbound, sir. Mercer nodded once. Good. But his attention drifted back toward Ethan almost instantly, as though the aircraft itself had become secondary now. Connor Hale noticed it too. Everyone did. The general was not here for the engine. He was here for the man who had heard it failing before anyone else could. Ethan seemed entirely uninterested in the attention. He moved slowly toward the aircraft again, stopping beneath the wing root, where rain-cooled air drifted through the open hangar doors carrying the smell of wet concrete and jet fuel. His weathered hand brushed lightly against the fuselage as if checking on an old friend. Connor found himself following him without thinking. Sir, he said carefully toward Mercer. With respect, who exactly is Ethan Vance? The general looked toward Connor for a moment before answering. You ever hear stories about maintenance crews during Vietnam? Connor nodded slowly. Some. Mercer's eyes shifted back toward Ethan. Back then aircraft came home held together by prayer, wire, and people nobody ever put medals on. Ethan let out the faintest sigh without turning around. Richard. Mercer ignored him. My father flew medevac support near Khe Sanh in 1968. Weather conditions were terrible. Constant emergency landings. Aircraft were failing faster than crews could repair them. Noah Briggs listened carefully now, barely breathing. The contractors had gone completely silent. Even the security personnel near the hangar entrance seemed drawn into the story despite themselves. Mercer continued quietly. One night my father's helicopter took structural damage during an emergency landing in heavy rain. Fuel pressure was collapsing. Rotor instability. Every pilot on that strip said the aircraft was finished. Ethan's shoulders stiffened slightly beneath the old jacket. Mercer noticed, but kept going. Then some 22-year-old crew chief crawled under the aircraft in the middle of a storm with nothing but a flashlight and a toolbox. Connor stared toward Ethan. That was him. Mercer nodded once. My father said he worked on the aircraft for almost 3 hours in knee-deep mud, while everyone else prepared for the possibility they would never get airborne again. Ethan finally spoke quietly without turning around. Your father exaggerated. Mercer almost smiled. No, he actually left parts out. The rain outside intensified again, rattling hard against the hangar roof while distant thunder rolled low across the airfield. Ethan remained still beside the aircraft, his hand resting lightly against the cold metal skin beneath the wing. Connor noticed something in the old man's posture now. Not pride. Weariness. Like memories were heavier than people realized. Mercer stepped closer slowly. He said you could hear problems in engines before diagnostics existed to measure them. Ethan looked down briefly at the concrete floor. Back then we had to. Mercer nodded. He said pilots trusted you more than the instruments. Ethan's faint smile returned for just a second. Pilots trusted anything that got them home. Noah glanced toward the grounded aircraft again. The massive surveillance plane suddenly felt different now. Less like a machine. More like part of a story stretching decades backward through storms and rotor wash and emergency landings no one else in the room could fully imagine. Connor swallowed hard. You rebuilt this aircraft 12 years ago, he said carefully toward Ethan. Ethan nodded once. Part of the reinforcement team. Then you already knew where the fracture could happen. Ethan finally turned toward him fully. No, Connor frowned slightly. Ethan's pale blue eyes settled calmly on the young lieutenant. I knew where tired aircraft usually break first when people stop listening to them. Another silence followed that one. Heavy. Quiet. Noah felt it pressing against everyone in the room now. Respect. Not the loud kind. The kind that arrives slowly after arrogance burns itself out. One of the contractors suddenly cleared his throat awkwardly. Sir, why was none of this in the maintenance archives? Mercer answered before Ethan could. Because men like him were too busy keeping aircraft flying to spend time talking about themselves. Ethan gave a dry chuckle at that. And because paperwork was never my strongest skill. A few nervous smiles appeared around the hangar for the first time all night. Even Connor looked slightly less rigid now. But then Mercer's expression shifted again, becoming more serious. He looked toward Ethan carefully. There is something else. Ethan's eyes narrowed faintly. Richard. Mercer ignored the warning in his voice. The reason command responded so fast tonight. Ethan sighed softly, almost tired. Do not. But Mercer continued anyway. The moment your name entered the maintenance system, an old operational flag triggered automatically through archived aviation command records. Connor blinked. Operational flag? Mercer nodded once without taking his eyes off Ethan. Somebody placed a standing priority notice on Ethan Vance almost 40 years ago. Noah felt cold unease creep slowly up his spine again. Connor stared in disbelief. A standing notice for what? Mercer answered quietly. If Ethan Vance ever walks onto a military flight line again, command wants to know immediately. The words hung over Hangar 12 long after Major General Richard Mercer stopped speaking. If Ethan Vance ever walks onto a military flight line again, command wants to know immediately. Nobody moved. Rain hammered against the roof in steady waves while the grounded aircraft sat silent beneath the floodlights. Its exposed engine housing still open like the machine itself was listening. Lieutenant Connor Hale stared at Ethan in complete disbelief now. The old man who had walked into the hangar wearing a faded jacket and carrying a worn leather toolbox was no longer just an old mechanic in anyone's eyes. He was something else entirely. Something buried deep inside military history that most people had forgotten existed. Ethan looked mildly irritated by all of it. Richard, he said quietly, you always did talk too much. General Mercer almost smiled. I learned that from my father. Ethan shook his head faintly and looked back toward the aircraft again. Outside, the storm had begun easing slightly. Rain still rolled across the runway, but the violent pounding overhead softened into a steady hiss against steel and concrete. Structural crews had started arriving near the far side of the hangar, unloading equipment beneath portable floodlights, while maintenance personnel moved with quiet efficiency around the damaged engine mount. But nobody inside Hangar 12 was really focused on the repairs anymore. They were watching Ethan. Noah Briggs stood near the maintenance cart holding his tablet forgotten against his chest. Earlier that night, he had seen Ethan as a quiet old man who somehow understood aircraft better than software. Now he realized the old man had probably forgotten more about aviation than everyone else in the hangar combined would ever learn. Connor slowly stepped closer to Ethan. The sharp arrogance that had defined him hours earlier was completely gone now. Sir, he said carefully, I owe you an apology. Ethan glanced sideways toward him. For what? Connor swallowed once. For the way I treated you. Ethan looked toward the aircraft instead of at him. You treated me like an old mechanic who wandered into your hangar. Connor nodded slowly. Because I thought you were. Ethan's faint smile returned. I am. The answer hit Connor harder than any lecture could have. Noah saw it happen in real time. The young lieutenant realizing that greatness did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived carrying an old toolbox and spoke softer than everyone else in the room. Mercer folded his arms loosely and looked toward the grounded aircraft. Structural crews think they can have the mount repaired before dawn. Ethan nodded once. Good. Mercer glanced toward him. You are not staying? Ethan looked mildly confused by the question. For what? To oversee the repair. Ethan gave a dry chuckle. You already have good people here. Connor looked down briefly at the concrete floor. A few hours ago that statement would have sounded impossible coming from Ethan Vance. Now it sounded generous. Ethan slowly walked toward the edge of the hangar where cool night air drifted inward, carrying the scent of rain and jet fuel. The storm clouds above the runway were beginning to break apart now, revealing faint strips of moonlight behind them. He stopped near the open doors and looked out across the dark airfield, where rows of aircraft lights glowed softly through the mist. For a moment, nobody interrupted him. The old man simply stood there quietly beneath the hangar lights, with one hand resting on the strap of the leather pouch that had traveled with him for nearly 60 years. No one noticed General Mercer, watching him carefully, not like an officer watching a civilian, like a son looking at one of the last living connections to his father. Finally, Mercer stepped beside him near the hangar entrance. "My father used to say something about you," he said quietly. Ethan kept his eyes on the runway. "Your father said a lot of things." Mercer smiled faintly. "He said the safest sound in Vietnam was hearing you say the aircraft would make it home." Ethan was silent for several long seconds after that. The runway lights reflected softly in his pale blue eyes, while distant turbines hummed somewhere beyond the storm. Then he gave the smallest shrug. Most of the time they did. Connor stood several feet behind them, listening carefully now. No one noticed the younger technicians doing the same. Nobody wanted to miss another word. Mercer finally extended his hand slowly toward Ethan. "Thank you," he said simply. Ethan looked at the hand for a moment before shaking it once. Firm, brief, quiet. Then he adjusted the strap of the old leather pouch across his shoulder and started walking toward the rain-darkened parking area outside the hangar. Nobody tried to stop him this time. The entire maintenance crew watched silently as the old man disappeared into the cool night air beneath the fading storm clouds. Connor remained near the aircraft long after Ethan was gone. The exposed engine housing sat open beneath the floodlights while structural crews prepared their equipment nearby. But Connor's attention stayed fixed on the empty hangar entrance where the old man had vanished. Noah stepped beside him quietly. "Sir." Connor shook his head slowly without looking away from the doorway. 6 weeks, he murmured. "We had every scanner, every diagnostic system, every model simulation money could buy." Noah nodded once. Connor glanced down toward the inspection mirror Ethan had accidentally left resting beside the maintenance cart. The old glass reflected the floodlights in soft, distorted lines. Simple, old, worn smooth by decades of use. Connor picked it up carefully in both hands. And he solved it with this. Noah looked toward the dark runway outside where the storm was finally beginning to clear. Somewhere far across the airfield, another aircraft engine started successfully, its deep turbine roar rolling through the night air like distant thunder. Connor listened to it for a moment before speaking softly enough that only Noah heard him. "Technology measures data," he said quietly, "but experience remembers survival."